What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists and military historians for centuries to come. As King Vorthak lunged for the ceremonial blade, his massive form moving with surprising speed, Park Hyun made a decision that would define humanity's place in the galaxy forever. Instead of defending himself or calling for help, he simply continued speaking in the ancient language, his voice never wavering even as 3 meters of enraged reptilian warrior bore down on him. The words he spoke were not a plea for mercy or a defensive charm, but the final component of his years-long plan. He recited the Keltharian rite of royal dissolution, a ceremony so ancient that most of the species had forgotten it existed. The rite could only be invoked by someone who possessed perfect knowledge of Keltharian law, culture, and history, and only in the presence of sufficient witnesses from the royal court. By exposing the false king's illegitimate rule and invoking the dissolution rite, Hyun was not just defeating Vorthok in intellectual combat, he was legally and spiritually destroying him. The effect was more devastating than any weapon. King Vorthak collapsed mid-charge, his body's own biological systems responding to the spiritual and psychological shock of absolute delegitimization. His scales lost their royal coloration entirely, fading to the gray-brown of commoners. His breathing became labored as his 3 hearts struggled with the sudden biochemical chaos. Within moments, the most feared warrior king in the galaxy had died not from violence, but from the complete destruction of his identity and purpose. The chamber erupted into chaos as Keltharian generals tried to process what they had witnessed. Some reached for weapons, others fell to their knees in recognition of the sacred rite that had just been performed. The other species' representatives watched in awe and terror as they realized that the quiet human diplomat had just accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. He had conquered an entire warrior civilization without firing a single shot. As medical teams rushed to confirm what everyone already knew, Park Hyun calmly gathered his documents and prepared to leave. The Keltharian Empire would need time to locate their true ruler and restructure their entire government. The planned war against humanity was now impossible, as no Keltharian commander could issue legitimate battle orders. Other species who had supported the military action found themselves reconsidering their positions, suddenly aware that humanity's diplomatic capabilities might be far more dangerous than their military ones. In the years that followed, the story would be told and retold across the galaxy. Some versions painted Hyun as a cold-blooded assassin who had murdered a king with words alone. Others saw him as a brilliant strategist who had prevented a devastating war through superior knowledge and preparation. The truth, as often happens, was more complex than either narrative. Park Hyun had indeed killed King Vorthak, but he had done so by revealing the truth and allowing Keltharian culture itself to deliver the fatal blow. In the end, he had not conquered the warrior species through strength or deception, but through a deeper understanding of who they truly were. The second phase of Korth Hal required each participant to demonstrate deep understanding of their opponent's culture and values. This was considered the most difficult part of the ancient ritual because it demanded not just knowledge, but genuine comprehension of how other species thought and felt. Many historical contests had been decided in this phase when one participant revealed their ignorance of their opponent's true nature. King Vorthak began his analysis of human culture with confidence that quickly faded as he spoke. He tried to dismiss human achievements as weakness, masquerading as strength, but his arguments showed he did not really understand what motivated human behavior. He described human cooperation as herd instinct, similar to prey animals that flock together for protection. He characterized their scientific sharing as naive stupidity that would get them conquered by smarter species. The king spoke about human moral evolution as evolutionary failure that had made them too soft for galactic survival. He claimed that their willingness to help strangers was a genetic defect that prevented them from properly prioritizing their own species. He suggested that human achievements were actually signs of a civilization that was doomed to extinction because they had abandoned the survival instincts that made species strong. As King Vorthak continued his analysis, it became clear to everyone in the chamber that he was missing something important about human nature. His words showed that he saw only weakness where others might see different kinds of strength. He understood human actions, but not the motivations behind them. His analysis was technically accurate in some ways, but completely failed to grasp the deeper principles that guided human civilization. The Keltharian advisors began to look worried as their king revealed the limitations of his understanding. Some of them had interacted with humans in trade negotiations and diplomatic meetings. They knew that humans were more complex than their king was describing. His analysis made them sound like simple-minded creatures when everyone knew they had built a successful interstellar civilization in record time. When King Vorthak finished his presentation, he seemed satisfied that he had exposed human weakness for all to see. He believed that his analysis had proven that humans were unsuited for galactic leadership and would eventually be conquered by stronger species. He settled back in his chair, confident that he had scored major points in the intellectual contest. Park Hyun stood to begin his analysis of Keltharian culture and immediately demonstrated a level of understanding that shocked everyone in the chamber. He spoke about the warrior's paradox, which was a concept that most Keltharians knew about, but rarely discussed openly. This was the fundamental tension between a culture built on conquest and their deep psychological need for worthy opponents, to fight. The human explained how Keltharian honor codes had evolved not just to glorify victory, but to ensure that conflict remained meaningful rather than mere slaughter. He described how their warrior traditions actually served to limit violence by creating rules that protected non-combatants and preserved the dignity of defeated enemies. He showed that Keltharian culture was more sophisticated than it appeared. To outsiders, Park Hyun spoke about the spiritual aspects of Keltharian warfare that few non-Keltharians understood. He explained how their warriors sought not just victory, but transformation through combat. He described how facing death in battle was seen as a pathway to understanding the deeper mysteries of existence. He revealed knowledge of religious concepts that were rarely shared with outsiders. The human continued by analyzing the social structures that supported Keltharian military culture. He explained how their society was organized to produce and support warriors while also maintaining the civilian population that made their civilization possible. He showed understanding of the economic systems that funded their military campaigns and the political structures that maintained unity across dozens of conquered worlds. What made Park Hyun's analysis so impressive was not just its accuracy, but its depth. He understood not only how Keltharian culture worked, but why it had developed the way it did. He explained how their harsh homeworld had shaped their values and how contact with other species had influenced their evolution. He demonstrated knowledge that could only come from years of careful study and direct experience. The Keltharian generals were nodding in recognition as the humans spoke. Everything he said was accurate and showed genuine understanding of their people's deepest values. Some of his insights were so perceptive that they revealed aspects of their own culture that they had never fully articulated. This was not the superficial knowledge that most aliens possessed, but true comprehension earned through dedicated effort. King Vorthak listened to Park Hyun's analysis with growing unease. The human was demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible for an outsider to acquire. He was speaking about Keltharian culture with the understanding of someone who had been born into it. This level of comprehension suggested preparation and planning that went far beyond normal diplomatic study. As Park Hyun concluded the second phase of Korth Hal, he had clearly won this round of the competition. His analysis of Keltharian culture had been comprehensive and accurate, while King Vorthak's understanding of humans had been shallow and flawed. The alien witnesses could see the difference in quality between the two presentations. Even the king's own advisors looked impressed by what they had heard. But the real contest was just beginning. The third phase of Korth Hall required absolute truth from both participants. This was where secrets were revealed and hidden motivations were exposed. It was the most dangerous part of the ritual because participants had to strip away all deception and reveal their real intentions. Many contests had ended in violence during this phase when unbearable truths were spoken aloud. King Vorthak began his truth-telling with revelations about Keltharian military capabilities and strategic plans. He spoke of secret weapon developments and hidden fleet positions. He revealed the true extent of their military preparations and the alliances they had formed with other warrior species. His goal was to demonstrate overwhelming strength that would make human resistance seem futile. The king described the 100 ship fleets that were hidden in dark space, waiting for orders to begin their assault on human worlds. He revealed the timeline for the planned invasion and the targets that had been selected for the first wave of attacks. He spoke about the coalition of species that would join the assault and the division of conquered territory that had already been negotiated. But when Park Hyun began his truth-telling phase, the entire chamber fell into stunned silence. He revealed information that would change everything, not just about the current conflict, but about the fundamental structure of Keltharian civilization. Speaking in the ceremonial language that proved his deep cultural knowledge, he made an accusation that struck at the very heart of the king's authority. Park Hyun announced that King Vorthak was not the legitimate ruler of the Keltharian people. Through years of careful research in ancient archives and genetic analysis of ceremonial artifacts, he had discovered that the royal bloodline had been broken 3 generations ago. The current king was descended from a branch family that had no right to the throne, according to traditional law. The revelation hit the assembled Keltharians like a physical blow. In their culture, legitimacy of rule was not just political, but spiritual. It was tied directly to genetic heritage and divine approval from their warrior ancestors. A false king could not lead them into righteous battle. He could not invoke the blessings that made victory possible. He could not even issue valid military commands according to their ancient legal codes. The implications of this revelation rippled through the chamber as the Keltharian advisors began to understand what they had just heard. If Park Hyun's claim was true, then everything they had planned was invalid. Their military preparations, their alliance negotiations, their entire war strategy was built on the authority of a ruler who had no right to command them. King Vorthak's reaction was immediate and terrible to witness. His carefully maintained composure shattered as the full impact of the accusation hit him. The purple markings on his scales began to fade and shift, becoming the dull gray-brown color that marked commoners. His 4 arms began to tremble as his body's own biological systems responded to the psychological shock. The chamber erupted into chaos as some Keltharians reached for weapons, while others fell to their knees in recognition of what they had just learned. The other alien species watched in amazement and terror as they realized that the quiet human diplomat had just accomplished something that seemed impossible. He had destroyed an entire warrior civilization with nothing but words and knowledge. But Park Hyun was not finished yet. The worst revelation was still to come. The Korth Howl began exactly at dawn, according to ancient Keltharian tradition. The crystal chamber had been completely rearranged to match the specifications from 1,000-year-old ritual texts. Ceremonial weapons lay between the 2 contestants, as symbols of the physical violence they had chosen to avoid. The lighting had been adjusted to create the proper sacred atmosphere. All the alien witnesses sat in carefully arranged positions based on their species status and relationship to the combatants. King Vorthak sat across from Park Hyun, looking massive and intimidating, even in this intellectual contest. His 4 arms rested on his knees and his yellow eyes glowed with confidence. He was certain that his knowledge of military history and warrior traditions would be more than enough to defeat this small human diplomat. He had spent his entire life learning about conquest and victory. How hard could it be to prove his people's superiority with words instead of weapons? The first phase of Court Hall required each participant to demonstrate their worthiness by recounting the greatest achievements of their people. This was meant to establish that both contestants had the right to speak for their species in such an important matter. King Vorthak went first, as was proper for the challenged party. His voice boomed through the chamber as he began to list Keltharian military victories. The king spoke of the Great Expansion when Keltharian warriors had conquered 47 star systems in less than a century. He described epic battles where small Keltharian forces had defeated much larger enemy armies through superior tactics and individual courage. He told the story of the siege of Veltar, where his own grandfather had held a fortress against impossible odds for 2 full years, eating nothing but emergency rations and drinking recycled water. King Vorthak's voice carried the weight of millennia, of military tradition. Each victory he described added to his people's reputation as the galaxy's most formidable warriors. He spoke of heroes who had fought impossible battles and won through pure determination. He described conquests that had expanded Keltharian territory across hundreds of light years. His words painted a picture of a species that had earned their place through strength and courage. The other aliens listened with a mixture of respect and fear as the king recounted his people's achievements, even species that were normally hostile. To Keltharians had to admit that their military record was impressive. The Vreks clicked their approval at particularly dramatic moments. The Netherians pulsed with colors that indicated grudging admiration. Everyone in the chamber was reminded why Keltharians were considered the premier warrior race in the galaxy. When King Vorthak finished speaking, he looked satisfied with his performance. He had presented a comprehensive list of military achievements that spanned thousands of years. No other species could match the Keltharian record of successful conquests and battlefield victories. He settled back in his chair, confident that the human diplomat would not be able to compete with such an impressive catalog of accomplishments. Park Hyun stood to begin his response and immediately surprised everyone by taking a completely different approach. Instead of trying to match military achievements, he began speaking about humanity's greatest victories over themselves. He talked about moral and social progress rather than battlefield conquests. His words described a different kind of strength that few of the alien species had considered. The human diplomat spoke of the abolition of slavery, which had been achieved not through conquest, but through moral evolution. He explained how humans had recognized that owning other people was wrong and had changed their entire economic system to eliminate the practice. He described the sacrifices that had been made and the resistance that had been overcome to achieve this moral victory. Park Hyun told the story of the Great Reconciliation, when ancient human enemies had learned to work together to heal their poisoned homeworld. He explained how industrial pollution had nearly destroyed Earth and how former rivals had cooperated to develop new technologies and change destructive habits. He spoke of scientists who had shared their discoveries freely rather than keeping them secret as weapons. The human continued with stories of explorers who had sacrificed their lives to save strangers from different cultures. He described medical researchers who had worked for decades to cure diseases that affected people they would never meet. He spoke of teachers who had dedicated their lives to educating children from families that could never repay them. Each story illustrated a different aspect of human achievement. What made Park Hyun's presentation so powerful was not just the content, but the way he connected these achievements to values that other species could understand. He explained how human cooperation was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. He showed how their willingness to help strangers created bonds that were stronger than those built through conquest. He demonstrated that moral progress required just as much courage as physical combat. The alien witnesses found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about humanity. They had always seen humans as a young, weak species that relied on technology rather than natural strength. But Park Hyun was describing accomplishments that required qualities they had not associated with human culture. The sacrifices he described showed courage that was different from but equal to warrior bravery. King Vorthak listened to the human's presentation with growing confusion and irritation. This was not what he had expected. Park Hyun was not trying to compete with Keltharian military achievements. Instead, he was suggesting that there were other kinds of victory that were equally important. The king did not understand how helping weaklings or sharing knowledge could be considered achievements worthy of respect. As the first phase continued, Park Hyun began to weave his individual stories into a larger narrative about human civilization. He explained how each moral victory had built upon previous ones, creating a pattern of progress that had transformed their entire species. He showed how cooperation and sacrifice had allowed humans to overcome challenges that would have destroyed a purely warrior culture. The human diplomat concluded his presentation by explaining how these achievements had prepared humanity for life among the stars. He argued that the same qualities that had allowed humans to overcome their own worst impulses would help them build positive relationships with alien species. He suggested that cooperation might be more valuable than conquest in a galaxy full of different cultures and capabilities. When Park Hyun finished speaking, the chamber was quiet for several long moments. The alien witnesses were processing what they had heard and trying to decide how to evaluate such different approaches to achievement. King Vorthak looked uncertain for the first time since the contest had begun. The human had not played by the rules he expected, and this made the king uncomfortable. The first phase had ended in what seemed like a draw, but the real contest was just beginning. King Vorthak rose from his throne-like chair, and his massive shadow fell across the diplomatic table. The other aliens in the room instinctively moved backward as they sensed the change in the Keltharian ruler. His purple scales were getting darker, which was a sign that his body was preparing for battle. The yellow glow in his eyes became brighter and more intense. His four muscular arms flexed and his claws extended slightly. Everyone in the room could feel the violence building inside the giant reptilian king. The guards around the chamber quietly checked their weapons. They had all heard stories about what happened when Keltharians lost control of their temper. The smaller species were already calculating escape routes in case the situation turned violent. The crystal walls that had seemed so beautiful before now felt like a trap that would contain whatever explosion was about to happen. But Park Hyun did not seem worried. He continued speaking in the ceremonial High Keltharian language as if nothing had changed. His voice remained calm and steady even as the 3-meter-tall alien king loomed over him. What he said next surprised everyone in the room, including King Vorthak himself. The human was not backing down or apologizing. Instead, he was doing something that no one had expected. Park Hyun was issuing a formal challenge according to ancient Keltharian tradition. His words followed a ritual pattern that was thousands of years old. He was invoking something called Korthal, which was a form of combat that predated Keltharian space travel. It was a way for leaders to settle disputes without spilling blood or destroying armies. The winner would determine policy for both sides, but the battle would be fought with minds instead of weapons. The Keltharian advisors began whispering urgently to each other. They recognized the ancient ritual even though it had not been used in centuries. Park Hyun was speaking the challenge formula perfectly, with all the correct ceremonial phrases and proper timing. This was not something he could have learned from studying books. This was knowledge that came from deep immersion in their culture. King Vorthak found himself in a difficult position. In Keltharian society, refusing a properly issued Korthal challenge was considered cowardice of the worst kind. A warrior who backed down from intellectual combat was seen as even weaker than one who fled from physical battle. The king had built his entire reputation on strength and courage. He could not refuse without losing face in front of his own people. The other alien species watched in fascination as the nature of the conflict began to change. What had started as a diplomatic meeting about to explode into war was transforming into something that resembled an ancient duel. The tension in the room shifted from fear of immediate violence to curiosity about what would happen next. Park Hyun had successfully changed the rules of engagement. The human diplomat explained the terms of Korth Hall to the assembled aliens. It was a three-part contest that tested knowledge, wisdom, and truthfulness. The first part required each participant to demonstrate their worthiness by recounting the achievements of their people. The second part tested understanding of opposing cultures and values. The third part demanded absolute honesty about motivations and capabilities. The winner would be determined by a combination of all three elements. King Vorthak realized that he was trapped by his own cultural traditions. His military advisors were reminding him in whispered words that the challenge had been issued correctly according to ancient law. His own people would lose respect for him if he refused, but accepting meant engaging in a type of combat where his physical advantages would be useless. This small human had somehow maneuvered him into a position where brute force could not win. The king looked around the chamber at the other alien species. Some of them were nodding with interest as they learned about Keltharian traditions they had never heard of before. Others seemed impressed that the human diplomat knew enough about their culture to invoke such an ancient ritual. Even his own generals were looking at Park Hyun with new respect. After several minutes of tense silence, King Vorthak made his decision. He could not back down without destroying his reputation as a fearless leader. He accepted the challenge using the proper ceremonial phrases in High Keltharian. His voice boomed through the crystal chamber as he agreed to meet the human in intellectual combat. The sound echoed off the walls, making his acceptance seem even more dramatic. The other aliens realized they were about to witness something unprecedented in galactic history. A formal Korth Hall had not been fought in hundreds of years. Most species had never seen one and did not fully understand what was about to happen. They knew it was some kind of contest between the human diplomat and the Keltharian king, but the exact nature remained mysterious. Park Hyun bowed formally to acknowledge the king's acceptance. His movements followed the ancient protocols perfectly, showing once again how deeply he understood Keltharian culture. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and it showed in every gesture and word. The other aliens were beginning to realize that this quiet human was far more dangerous than he appeared. The chamber began to reconfigure according to ritual requirements. Ancient Keltharian law specified how the combat area should be arranged. Ceremonial weapons were placed between the contestants as symbols of the violence they were choosing to avoid. Special seating was arranged for witnesses according to their species and status. The Crystal Hall transformed from a diplomatic meeting room into something resembling a sacred arena. As the preparations continued, the tension in the room continued to build. Everyone knew they were about to witness something historic. The fate of multiple species would be determined by this ancient contest between a giant reptilian warrior king and a small human diplomat. The outcome would decide whether the galaxy went to war or found a path to peace. King Vorthak looked confident as he took his position for the ritual combat. He was used to winning through intimidation and superior strength. He believed his knowledge of military history and warrior traditions would be enough to defeat this upstart human. He did not yet realize how much trouble he was in. Park Hyun sat across from the alien king looking calm and prepared. He had spent 15 years getting ready for this moment. He knew things about Keltharian culture that even the king did not know. More importantly, he had discovered secrets that could change everything. The real battle was about to begin. The arguing continued for hours and got worse with each passing moment. More alien species were picking sides, and most of them were choosing to support King Vorthak. The Vrex delegation made loud clicking sounds with their mandibles, which meant they approved of attacking human worlds. Their compound eyes reflected the crystal lights, making them look even more frightening. The gaseous Netherians pulsed with angry red and orange colors that filled their containment suits. Even the normally peaceful Aquatic Federation representatives were staying silent, which everyone knew was a very bad sign. Park Hyun sat quietly through all of this. He kept writing in his notebook and occasionally looked up to observe the different species around the room. To everyone watching, he looked like a clerk who was trying to document the failure of human diplomacy. Some aliens were starting to feel sorry for him because he seemed so helpless and small. Others were getting annoyed because his calm behavior seemed inappropriate for such a serious situation. King Vorthak was becoming more frustrated with each minute that passed. In Keltharian culture, warriors were supposed to respond to challenges, with either aggression or submission. The human was doing neither, and this confused and angered the king. He began directing more of his accusations specifically at Park Hyun, trying to get some kind of emotional response from the quiet diplomat. King spoke about human colonies that had appeared on contested worlds. He showed holographic maps that made human expansion look like a spreading infection across the galaxy. He talked about resources that humans had taken and cultures that had been changed by human contact. His voice got louder and his scales got darker with each accusation. Finally, after many hours of listening, Park Hyun was given permission to respond. Everyone in the room expected him to beg for mercy or offer desperate compromises to avoid war. The smaller alien species were already feeling sorry for humanity because they thought the situation was hopeless. The warrior species were eager to hear what pathetic excuses the human would make. Park Hyun stood up slowly and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a small translation device, but instead of using it, he began to speak without any technological help. What came out of his mouth shocked everyone in the room. He was speaking perfect High Keltharian, which was the ancient ceremonial language of the royal family. The effect was immediate and dramatic. King Vorthak stepped backward in surprise. His yellow eyes got very wide, and his 4 arms stopped moving. The Keltharian generals behind him began whispering to each other in confusion. High Keltharian was supposed to be known only by members of the royal bloodline and their closest advisors. How could this ordinary-looking human speak their most sacred language? Park Hyun spoke with perfect pronunciation and proper ceremonial tone. His words followed the ancient patterns that had been used in royal courts for thousands of years. He was not just speaking the language, he was using it correctly, according to traditions that most Keltharians had forgotten. This was not something he could have learned from books or computer programs. This was knowledge that came from years of living among the Keltharian people. The human diplomat began by acknowledging King Vorthak with the proper royal titles. He showed respect for Keltharian military achievements and honored their warrior traditions. But then he began to subtly challenge the premise of the king's accusations. He did not deny that humans were expanding across the galaxy. Instead, he suggested that this expansion was natural for a young and vigorous species. Park Hyun spoke about how Keltharians had once been young explorers themselves. He reminded them of their own period of rapid expansion when they had claimed dozens of star systems in just a few centuries. He drew parallels between ancient Keltharian heroes and modern human pioneers. He made it sound like human expansion was following the same pattern that had made the Keltharians great. The other alien species listened in amazement as the human continued speaking in the ceremonial language. Some of them had never heard High Keltharian spoken before because it was used only in the most formal royal ceremonies. The fact that a human could speak it so well was shocking. It meant this diplomat was not the ordinary clerk he appeared to be. King Vorthak was struggling to process what he was hearing. The human was showing deep knowledge of Keltharian culture and history. He was quoting ancient texts and referencing battles from thousands of years ago. He was speaking about Keltharian heroes with the reverence that only came from true understanding. This was not what the king had expected from a human diplomat. But Park Hyun was not finished. He began to reframe the entire conflict in terms that resonated with Keltharian warrior culture. He suggested that the king's fear of human expansion was actually recognition of humanity as a worthy opponent. He pointed out that the Keltharians had always been at their best when facing strong enemies. Their greatest victories had come against foes who challenged them rather than those who surrendered easily. The human diplomat spoke about Earth itself as a forge that had shaped humanity into something unique. He described how humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars. He explained how they had learned to work together despite their differences. He made it sound like humanity had been prepared by their harsh homeworld to become the kind of opponent that Keltharians could respect. The chamber fell silent as Park Hyun continued his speech. Even the most warlike species were impressed by his knowledge and eloquence. The Keltharian generals were looking uncomfortable because they could not find fault with his use of their ceremonial language or his understanding of their culture. King Vorthak himself seemed frozen in place, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. Park Hyun was presenting humanity not as victims pleading for mercy, but as equals offering a different kind of relationship. He spoke about the potential for cooperation between species that understood strength and determination. He suggested that war between Keltharians and humans would be wasteful because both species had so much to offer each other. The human diplomat was slowly turning the meeting from a declaration of war into something else entirely. He was using the Keltharians' own cultural values to make his arguments. He was showing that he understood them better than they understood themselves. And most importantly, he was demonstrating that humans were not the weak, cowardly species that King Vorthak had described. As Park Hyun spoke, the other aliens began to realize that something extraordinary was happening. This was not a typical diplomatic negotiation. This was something much more complex and dangerous. The quiet human had revealed himself to be far more knowledgeable and capable than anyone had imagined. The king was beginning to understand that he was facing an opponent unlike any he had encountered before. The big crystal hall on Station Nexus was full of angry voices and scared faces. 12 different alien species had come together for what everyone thought might be their last peaceful meeting. The room was huge and made of clear crystal that sparkled with different colors when the aliens moved around. But today, nobody was looking at the pretty lights. Everyone was looking at the big, scary aliens in the middle of the room. King Vorthak stood taller than everyone else. He was almost 3 times as tall as a human and looked like a giant lizard that walked on 2 legs. His skin was covered in purple and black scales that showed he was royalty among his people, the Keltharians. He had 4 powerful arms, and when he moved them, everyone could see the muscles underneath his scales. His eyes glowed yellow like fire, and when he spoke, his voice was so loud it made the crystal walls shake. The king was very angry about humans. He kept shouting that humans were like a disease spreading across the galaxy. His generals stood behind him, and they looked just as scary. They all had scars from many battles and weapons hanging from their belts. When their king spoke, they nodded and made growling sounds that meant they agreed. The other alien species in the room were getting nervous. Some of them were already talking about joining the Keltharians in a war against humanity. Then something unexpected happened. A human walked into the room and nobody really noticed him at first. His name was Park Hyun, and he looked very ordinary compared to all the big, scary aliens around him. He was wearing a simple gray suit like the kind office workers wear on Earth. He carried just one small briefcase and walked quietly to his seat. Some of the aliens looked at him and thought he looked weak and pathetic. They wondered why Earth had sent such a small, ordinary person to such an important meeting. Park Hyun sat down and opened his briefcase. He took out some papers and a pen and started writing notes like he was in a boring business meeting. He did not look scared, even though King Vorthak was shouting about destroying human worlds. He did not try to interrupt or argue. He just sat there writing and listening. This made some of the aliens even more angry because they thought he was not taking the situation seriously. What none of the aliens knew was that Park Hyun was not ordinary at all. He had spent 15 years learning everything he could about the Keltharians. He had lived with them and learned their language. He had studied their history and their culture. He knew things about them that even some Keltharians did not know. He had been preparing for this day for a very long time. The meeting continued with more angry shouting from King Vorthak. The king talked about how humans were taking planets that belonged to other species. He showed pictures of human cities on different worlds. Each new human settlement made him angrier. He said humans were stealing resources and changing the cultures of peaceful planets. His voice got louder and his scales got darker as he spoke. Other alien species started agreeing with the king. The Vreks were insect-like creatures with many eyes. They clicked their approval when the king talked about attacking human worlds. The Netherians were made of gas and changed colors to show their emotions. They turned red, which meant they wanted war. Even the water-breathing aliens who usually stayed neutral were quiet, which was a bad sign. Park Hyun kept taking notes. Sometimes he would ask a question, but his questions seemed innocent. He would ask about Keltharian military strength or about their history. The aliens thought he was just trying to learn how hopeless the human situation was. They did not realize. He was gathering information for his own plan. King Vorthak was getting more and more frustrated with the quiet human. In Keltharian culture, being calm during conflict was either a sign of cowardice or disrespect. Either way, it made the king angry. He started directing more of his shouting at Park Hyun specifically. He called humans cowards and weaklings. He said they hid behind technology instead of fighting with honor. The other aliens in the room began to sense that something big was about to happen. The tension was getting thicker like the air before a thunderstorm. Some of the smaller species were already thinking about leaving. They had seen Keltharians fight before and knew how violent they could be. The guards around the room were checking their weapons just in case. But Park Hyun remained calm. He finished writing his notes and put his pen down. He looked up at King Vorthak for the first time since entering the room. His expression was still peaceful, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. It was like he had been waiting for this moment, and now it was finally time. The king noticed the change in the human and stopped shouting. For a moment, the huge crystal hall was completely quiet. Everyone was looking at the small human sitting across from the giant lizard king. Nobody knew what was about to happen, but they could all feel that something important was coming. Park Hyun slowly stood up from his chair. He was still much smaller than any of the aliens in the room, but somehow he seemed bigger now. He looked directly at King Vorthak, and for the first time since the meeting started, he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that nobody else knew. The king did not like that smile. His 4 hands formed fists, and his yellow eyes got brighter. The other aliens moved back a little because they could sense the violence that was building in the room. Some of them were already thinking about the war that would start when the diplomatic meeting failed. But Park Hyun was not worried about war. He had come to this meeting with a different plan. A plan that would end the conflict before it started. A plan that would shock the entire galaxy and change everything. All he had to do now was wait for the right moment to put his plan into action. The meeting was about to take a turn that nobody expected.